Good evening. This is Left, Right and Centre. I'm Nidhi Razdan. Foreign Minister Sushma Swaraj addresses the UN General Assembly in a measured but firm address where she took on Nawaz Sharif and the issue of cross-border terrorism. She talked about countries that finance terrorists and the human rights violations in Balochistan. Her speech came on a day when the Prime Minister chaired a meeting with top officials in Delhi on reviewing the Indus Waters Treaty between the two countries, where India has decided to make maximum use of river waters that it is entitled to, but hasn't ruled out further steps in the future. The question we're asking tonight is whether India is succeeding in the diplomatic isolation of Pakistan. But first, let's hear some bits of Sushma Swaraj's speech to the UN, where she told Nawaz Sharif to give up his dream of acquiring Jammu and Kashmir.
21 तारीख को इसी मंच से पाकिस्तान के प्रधानमंत्री ने भारत के संबंध में दो बातें कही, जिनका जवाब देना चाहूंगी। एक तो उन्होंने कहा कि मेरे देश में मानवाधिकार का उल्लंघन हो रहा है। मैं कहना चाहूंगी कि जिनके अपने घर शीशे के हों, उन्हें दूसरों पर पत्थर नहीं फेंकने चाहिए। जरा एक बार बगल में झांक कर देख लें क्या हो रहा है बलूचिस्तान में, और वो खुद क्या कर रहे हैं वहां। मैं कह सकती हूं यहां कि आज जो बलूचिस्तान में हो रहा है वो यातनाओं की पराकाष्ठा है। और दूसरी बात उन्होंने कही कि भारत जो शर्तें बातचीत के लिए लगा रहा है वो हमें मंजूर नहीं है। ये समझ नहीं रही कौन सी शर्त, किस शर्त की बात की जा रही है। हमारे शपथ ग्रहण समारोह से पहले जब हमने पाकिस्तान के प्रधानमंत्री को समारोह में आने का न्योता दिया था, आमंत्रण दिया था, तो क्या कोई शर्त रखी थी? मैं स्वयं इस्लामाबाद गई थी और कॉम्प्रिहेंसिव बायलैटरल डायलॉग हमने शुरू किया था इकट्ठे बैठकर। क्या कोई शर्त रखी थी? प्रधानमंत्री मोदी काबुल से दिल्ली आते हुए लाहौर उतर गए थे, कोई शर्त लगा कर गए थे क्या? ये कौन सी शर्तों की बात हो रही है?
Well, joining us first on the program tonight, Ambassador Hardeep Puri, India's former envoy to the United Nations, Ajay Shukla, defense expert and strategic affairs expert here in the studio. Ambassador Puri, to you first, what would be your overall assessment of the speech today? This was Sushma Swaraj, at least according to me, who seemed very firm, very measured in her response, and someone who didn't also dwell too much on Pakistan. She kind of came to Pakistan towards the end of her speech.
Nidhi, in terms of speeches delivered by an Indian External Affairs Minister at the high-level segment of the UNGA, both in terms of context and content, I think this is the best speech delivered ever. It is absolutely pointed in terms of the main theme of the high-level segment, which is the SDGs, and then it leads into the immediate concerns which we have as a country, those relating to our western neighbor, issues relating to terrorism, and it makes constructive recommendations. So I have no hesitation in saying, Nidhi, that this is perhaps the best speech any external affairs minister has ever delivered in a high-level segment of the UNGA. And I say this based on my memory, and my memory in this context happens to be a long one. I've been around for a while.
Well, Ambassador Puri, certainly high words of praise from you there. Ambassador KC Singh is also with us on the program tonight, and Mr. Pawan Verma, who's also served as a diplomat in the Indian Foreign Service. But KC Singh, to you first, do you agree with Ambassador Puri that this is, as he calls it, the best ever speech made by an Indian foreign minister? What did you think of it? Do you think that she effectively made her point?
I think it's a good speech. I don't want to compare because my memory of speeches there may not go that far. But it's a very good speech, balanced. She didn't start off with Pakistan, started with the theme of the UN General Assembly, which was sustainable development, linked it to India's domestic agenda and Mr. Modi's different schemes, and made the argument that 1/6 of humanity lives in India. So if sustainable development is achievable here, then the world is well on its way. And then she went on to climate change, which again the world is very concerned about, and announced that India will be signing the Paris Agreement on Gandhiji's birthday, and then brought in terrorism, and that too via 26/11 and the strike in Delhi, and therefore part of the global experience of terrorism, and then fine-tuned it and brought it to Pakistan. The only weakness, I think, was that on Kashmir, it was more like she was addressing the domestic audience by saying it's an inalienable part of India, because what we needed to answer was Nawaz Sharif's argument that Security Council resolutions had not been implemented by the UN, where she should have turned around and said that it is Pakistan that is responsible for those not being implemented. They never withdrew their troops.
That's right.
They made demographic changes in that part, and she should have given it back to them and said, not only that, you came to Shimla, took your prisoners away, and you said you'll settle it bilaterally. So where do the Security Council resolutions come in, etc.? That argument should have been made. The other argument probably was for a domestic audience, which she needed to make. But overall, I think an effective speech and well delivered.
Well, Mr. Verma, what did you think? The point here is, I think everyone agrees that it was a good, firm speech, and she made all the right points. But is the world really listening to what India is saying on Pakistan, or are they just nodding along and kind of telling us, yes, we understand? But when you scratch the surface, even if the events of the past few days, I think we have to take a step back and look at those carefully. For example, the Russian military exercises with Pakistan in Pakistan. Do you really think the world is listening to us?
Well, Nidhi, a few quick points in response. First of all, I think that there were at least 3 important plus points to Sushma Swaraj's speech today. Firstly, I think I'm happy that she maintained the asymmetry between India and Pakistan. Pakistan's foreign policy consists entirely of it being anti-India. India is a rising global power, and its foreign policy enunciation at the highest forum of the General Assembly must be more than Pakistan. And I'm therefore glad that she began with other themes and then came to terrorism. On terrorism itself, I think she made the right argument that if a state is making terrorism an instrument of state policy, there may be one nation which may be at the receiving end of that policy, but any state which uses terrorism as an instrument of state policy is a threat globally. In other words, it's not about us. It's about the world and its fight against the menace of international terrorism, which is the argument we should be making across the world to isolate Pakistan on terrorism. Thirdly, I think when she mentioned Balochistan, and this is now a prerogative of this government which has made this an initiative, she made it in the context that if terrorism is the biggest violation of human rights globally, then a state that practices such terrorism must inevitably violate human rights within its own country, and therefore the reference to Balochistan. Now, to your question whether this makes a global impact, her speech, although Mr. Hardeep Puri in somewhat hyperbolic manner called it the best speech he has ever heard, and that is befitting of someone associated or speaking for the BJP, I would say that ultimately UNGA speeches have become a routine ritual. In her case, she had a domestic audience because the speech was taking place after Uri and everybody was looking forward in anticipation to what she says. Otherwise, Mr. Nawaz Sharif spoke in a near empty hall, and while Mr. Sushma Swaraj had an enthusiastic Indian delegation clapping, by and large such statements are part of the routine of the annual General Assembly session.
That's an important point.
My last point is, therefore my last point is that this kind of speech needs rigorous, sustained, consistent, behind the scenes follow-up in the chancelleries of the world with strategic clarity, making the point that Pakistan must be seen as an international pariah because it is sponsoring terrorism.
And that's a very important point that you make. That how does Ajay Shukla, how does India then sustain this from here? And Pawan Verma has a point. A lot of the world does see the India-Pakistan spats at the UN as annual rituals. And how do we make sure the world this time is listening and looking at it differently?
You know, just to give a little quantitative point here, I measured how much time was allocated to various subjects. She spoke for 18 minutes, out of which 8 minutes were on terrorism. And I'm not surprised about that, because she was coming off Mr. Modi's promise in Kozhikode, delivered on Saturday, that because of the Uri attack, India was going to retaliate by isolating Pakistan in global forums. So given that, I'm not surprised that she devoted such a high percentage of her speech to terrorism. Your question on how this is going to move beyond the ritual of giving a speech and actually transform into the isolation of Pakistan, that is a far more difficult question. The actual process involves working with the legislatures of countries like the United States, working Capitol Hill, working the senators, working the people in the House of Representatives, and bringing them around to the conviction that Pakistan is not a country that the United States law can be allowed to support, and that United States funding should be going towards. Now you're already seeing this happen. Huh? The F-16s, the 8 F-16s that Pakistan was cleared to buy, funding was not allocated because Congress refused to pass funding for Pakistan for those 8
But
F-16s.
is Pakistan looking increasingly isolated to you? I ask in the context of China, in the context of Iran, in the context of Russia.
It's going to be a long, slow, hard process. This Russian, the exercise, I think much is being made out of this.
Nidhi, can I
but
come
in
in
fact,
on
it's just a small sort of gesture being made by Russia to convey disapproval to India about the exercises that India is doing with the United States.
So it's more about the US-India equation.
It's more about the US-India. But as far as isolation is concerned, Pakistan is being gradually isolated as opinion is building up and clarity is building up in capitals across the world, but this can't be expedited beyond a point.
Ambassador Puri, you wanted to come in on that. Do you agree with Ajay? This is going to be a long haul. Obviously it is, you know
Yes.
it better than anybody else.
Yeah. You know, I've spent many years, perhaps the best years of my life there. But Nidhi, I would like to say that, I would have been surprised if my friend Pawan had not referred to my membership of the BJP. But let me now draw on my experience as permanent representative and having lived in New York for a period of about 10 years. Let me say the following. There are other major takeaways from this speech, and we would be making a big mistake if we overlook those. Casey has referred to some of them. One of them, for instance, India's decision to ratify the climate accord on 2nd October is a very major one. Number two, on the Comprehensive Convention Against Terrorism, and here I must respectfully submit to my very dear friend Mr. Shukla, who is very knowledgeable, that if we decide to put the Comprehensive Convention to vote, it is going to be a slightly different thing, because the only two countries which were opposing the Comprehensive Convention earlier were Syria and to some extent the United States. Now, if we can talk to them and subject it to a vote, I would like to see which country will actually come out and stand out in the open and say that they support terrorism and therefore they are opposing the Comprehensive Convention. Two other things. Speeches in the UNGA are always made for the record. Equally, they are always directed at the domestic audience. What I found so refreshing about this, and I agree with Casey that, by any yardstick it's a good speech, but why do I say that this is the best speech ever? Because I go back to 1993 when I was on the Americas desk, then I go back to 2009 when I was PR. And I've always found the speeches that our ministers or even heads of state and government deliver at the UNGA, they are bureaucratic exercises. This one, the kind of crafting we saw here, short sentences, punchy messages, the very fact that Prime Minister Modi's concept of climate justice has come in, I think from the point of view of a chronicler, from the point of view of a researcher, from somebody who knows the UN system, this is a very rich speech, and it will be remembered not only for the strategic restraint it is anchored in, but it shows India up to be a very responsible country which has used a multilateral platform like the UN to convey its messages in a sober, mature and a constructive way.
I think
Therefore,
certainly it's a very sober.
to my friend Mr. Verma, it's not hyperbole. This is actually a very positive and a very welcome speech.
No, it's certainly sober, and she
Well,
was
Nidhi,
able to
if
get
I
the
may respond.
message across. Go ahead, Mr. Verma, then I'll come to all of you on the Indus Waters Treaty. Go ahead, Mr. Verma. Yeah.
First of all, without being so euphoric, I myself said that the speech had some very significant pluses. Now we can waste time about whether it's the best speech ever heard in the UN or the best speech ever India gave. I've heard some very, without the kind of experience that Mr. Puri seems to have in the UN, we've all heard some very fine speeches there, including that of Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee.
I was going to mention
and
Mr.
others.
Vajpayee.
So therefore there's no point getting into this kind of mechanical comparison. The fact of the matter is that a speech has been made at the UN which dealt substantially with the issue of terrorism. There was the context in which India made it. There was the outrage of Uri right as a background to the speech, and a concerted attempt by India to follow up on the speech in order to isolate Pakistan on the issue of global terrorism, I think would be the right kind of measure to judge the success of the speech. Because merely crafting a speech is not enough.
And I think the important thing people have to remember is, as a point you've all made, is that this is going to be a long haul and it will take time. Ambassador KC Singh, this has also come on a day, as I mentioned, when you had the Prime Minister chairing this meeting on the Indus Waters Treaty, and what has emerged from that is, you know, these dramatic words where he has said in the meeting that blood and water cannot flow together. And yet, at the moment, the options that are being looked at are very much within the framework of the treaty, and for India to maximize what it can within that framework. That's a long haul too, isn't it? Whatever India decides to do on the waterfront.
Well, just firstly, just by way of recall, I think it was your program 4 or 5 days ago,
Yeah.
where I raised it, then Hardeep endorsed it. So we started this whole debate. I think what the government has done is, there's a lot of comment in the marketplace saying, people who are saying this is not doable, China will do it. So there's a lot of debate it has stirred. But essentially what the government is doing is, let me explain it in very simple terms, is not to reject the treaty or to discard it, but to pick up the terms of the treaty and really interpret the clauses more strictly. You take a simple case, you take Baglehar proposal on Chenab. Now Pakistan challenged it. It went to a Swiss arbitrator when I was in the ministry. 2007 we got the result. Largely the arbitrator sided with India. It said it was okay, some little design changes, the pondage is all right, because any run of the water, run of the river hydroelectric project requires some storage, what is called pondage. So largely Baglehar has international approval. Now we can replicate it. Pakistan will object every time, but we can become less mindful of the objections and say this has already been gone into. So those are the ways to go ahead with it. Like China goes on ignoring all the run of the river projects they're making on the upper Brahmaputra. They said, no, this is not interrupting the flow. So now therefore Pakistan, this is a signal to Pakistan that if you use terror, you calibrate it on and off and you try influencing dialogue,
we can use water.
Then some other levers India will develop which can be switched on and off.
And interestingly, what top government officials were telling me tonight is that this is just the first meeting that the Prime Minister is going to have on this issue. Ajay, they're saying that nothing is off the table. Now, I don't know whether that is a pressure tactic to send a message to Pakistan that, look, you know, this doesn't necessarily mean that the abrogation of the treaty is off the table. How do you read it?
Everybody sees the Indus Water Treaty as an easy pressure point on Pakistan, and it is. The problem is that unlike terrorism, which is a pressure point that has a certain moral validity and certain acceptance even within Pakistan, the Indus Waters Treaty and any kind of reinterpretation that we do will directly hit at the people of Pakistan. The farmers, we are talking about serious public opinion in Pakistan. And at a time when the Prime Minister has actually given a speech reaching out to the people of Pakistan and talking about in getting them to rise up against their hukumrans and question their policies on terrorism, to actually alienate them by questioning the Indus Water Treaty, it's a debatable issue. It runs contrary to one strand of foreign policy. That having been said, there is no question about it. India has a lot of leeway, a lot of slack in interpreting the treaty. We have not taken advantage of the three western rivers at all in terms of run-of-the-river projects, and there's a lot we can do. But we must always keep in mind that we are talking about serious public opinion affectation in Pakistan.
Ambassador Puri, if you could weigh in on that, because you and KC Singh, as he was pointing out, did agree on this point the other day. But isn't there also another point that as India looks to be a part of the global world order, as a member of international groupings like the NSG, as it aspires to a permanent membership of the UN Security Council, does it create a problem for us to be seen to be walking away from an international treaty? Is that something that will be factored in as well, if it came to that?
Nidhi, the government of India and India as a country will be judged by our actions, not by what KC and I say on television screens. I think KC and I have been around in this game for a while, and I think all that we are doing is to point to a range of options which the government of the day has. Insofar as international treaty is concerned, any international treaty for that matter, you have to look at it in terms of the overall framework of the rule of law. You cannot have a situation where a treaty which is anchored in the rule of law has only one side following the rule of law and the other violating the rule of law with impunity. I think the name of the game is not the isolation of Pakistan, which is the title of your program, but something much more, that we have to send home to Pakistan a very simple message that if you continue to conduct business as usual, which essentially involves using terror as an instrument of policy, the other side also has options which will have to be endorsed by the international community. That's why we are going to the international community. That's why Sushma is speaking to the UNGA. That's why the Prime Minister is speaking from Kerala. And those are the messages which go around. At the end of the day, we will see what are the options on the ground and how we can diplomatically, politically, and in other terms, get that message across to Pakistan. So believe me, I don't think the government of India is ready to renounce responsible behavior.
Well, Pawan Verma, last word to you tonight. What would then, according to you, are likely to be then the next immediate steps? We've seen now the UNGA, that was the first big test in terms of the diplomatic missive. Is the SAARC summit then the next area of focus? Do you think that the Prime Minister should go and make a point there very strongly on Pakistani soil, on Pakistani terrorism, or should he just withdraw?
Now, 2 or 3 points quickly on what has been said so far. I think we are not privy as yet to the briefing the Prime Minister has received on the Indus Waters Treaty. He has made a statement, but we would like to know what the government is planning to do, because after all, if there is action to be taken, it must come into the public realm. So I reserve my judgment. I agree with Ajay that the threat of using the provisions of the treaty more fully will have a great psychological impact on Pakistan. 65% of Pakistani territory is irrigated, including the whole of the Punjab through the canal system. Pakistan has the largest canal network, and all of it is almost provided water from the Indus River basin. So that kind of impact is there, and there are 3.6 million square feet of storage that India can build under the existing treaty, which we have not. So there are provisions of the existing treaty which can be leveraged to exercise a psychological pressure. And I don't yet know, and therefore I reserve my comments, because obviously perhaps Mr. Hardeep Puri seems to know it, but the nation doesn't, as to what the Prime Minister has been briefed and what exactly the government is intending to do. That is one point. As regards SAARC, I see very little dividend of going into a forum with this kind of bilateral acrimony overwhelming that forum completely. The governments must see how Mr. Rajnath Singh was treated when he went, and what it is going to gain by proceeding with a ritual which has lost most of its spirit as a result of the genuine hostility now between India and Pakistan.
And I think that will be the
third and last point is we need to go to the global capital to follow up on Sushma Swaraj's speech. Otherwise, it will be a good speech and followed by the same flip-flops that we have seen in the past as far as foreign policy towards Pakistan is concerned.
As Ambassador Puri says, the best speech ever that needs to be followed up, certainly as you put it, with world capitals in a serious way. Thank you very much to all of you for joining us tonight with your insights on this big diplomatic story. The focus, of course, tomorrow is going to shift to the United States and to the first presidential debate between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. We'll see you again on that tomorrow. Goodbye.